Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let me take up the argument Kate was making before the break because I found it pretty persuasive. I also have heard a lot of this rhetoric from critics of Ukraine aid, which seems to me to be not backed up by any data often. So one tracker that I have been keeping an eye on is the Ukraine support tracker at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, which is a German research institute. And I'm not saying this is the be-all, end-all of the numbers, but just some numbers at least to chew on. According to it, the U.S. military aid to Ukraine is about 42 billion euros so far, and that is a majority of the aid from the U.S. There's humanitarian aid and then financial aid of about 24 billion euros. But Kim, I think Kate makes a strong argument here that what Ukraine most needs from the U.S. is not financial aid necessarily. That's the kind of thing that EU institutions can pick up. What it needs is U.S. arms. So the House very well could take up a bill and create the kind of Ukraine aid package that Republicans could support and could get behind. And then they can stop making the arguments that the U.S. is funding bureaucrats in Ukraine. And to the point about strengthening the Republican position on security, it seems to me that if they went ahead and did that, they would also strengthen the House's argument and Speaker Johnson's argument that these things can be taken separately. If they pass their Israel aid bill this week and get right to work writing a Ukraine aid bill, then I think they can make the argument to the Senate that we do actually intend to do this. Otherwise, I wonder where this goes, because you may have the House pass an Israel bill and the Senate pass some sort of combined Israel, Ukraine, border security, Taiwan package. And then, Kim, do we just go to conference committee and it's a staring contest?
Yeah, correct. I couldn't agree with all of this more. It's well past time for the House to start being proactive instead of reactive to all of this, especially because there's something else important that they can do. It's important to rewind the tape just a little bit and remember where we were before Hamas's horrific attack on Israel. Prior to that moment and the discussion now about Israel aid, the broad contours of a potential Ukraine package were beginning to form in Congress. And the idea is that there would be some money for Ukraine that Republicans would be deeply involved in deciding the where and how of, but also in order to ally some of those on the right who are concerned about foreign funding while we have some problems with our own border here in the U.S., the other piece of that was going to be a border bill. And all of this began to go sideways when the White House put out its own proposal that included a border piece that is laughable to most Republicans in that the money included in it seems to be entirely aimed toward hiring more people to process the never-ending floods of people pouring across our border, rather than anything to do with policy changes that would hopefully put an end to some of those enormous numbers. For instance, changes to our asylum law and the standards that are being used to let people in. This is why Republicans need to step up, because if they don't like what the White House has put forward, if they don't like what I think a number of Senate Republicans seem willing to rubber stamp as part of a broader deal, then they need to be putting forward their own counter bill. And as you say, Kyle, this would also help in terms of, I think, strengthening support, not just among some members for getting both of these pieces done, but also among the public who've been looking at Republicans and unfortunately, I think, taking a cue from a party that has not been as vocal and forceful about what it would like to see happen in Ukraine. And the reality is that while there's a handful of isolationists on one side who really don't want to see any Ukraine money, the vast majority of Republicans are there. They just want the right circumstances and scenario. Now, all of that, I just have to say, is in some ways a little easier said than done. Let's not forget Johnson has a 4-vote majority, and there are a number of Republicans who are very opposed to Ukraine aid. So I think one of the reasons they haven't come forward is that he needs to get his whole party behind a package, and that is a tough deal with a majority the size of what he has.
But as we think about the confidence of whether these bills, whether separately or in a combined package, will get through, Kate, maybe it's worth thinking about how much of this political jockeying in the press is trying to make opening offers. So we have the White House veto threat now of this House Israel bill. We have the Senate saying that they intend to move a combined package, that they think that's a better option. We have the House saying that they don't want a combined package. They want to take these issues up separately. But Kate, I mean, some of that I think is negotiating in the press. And I have my doubts whether if you get an Israel alone bill, for example, through both the House and the Senate, and maybe it doesn't have all of the IRS rescissions that the House wants, but it has some kind of pay-fors, and maybe it doesn't have all of the humanitarian aid that Biden wants, but it has some of it. I have my doubts about whether Biden would actually veto that at the end of the day. And I think the same is true for this House versus Senate argument on the process, whether to do this as one bill or many bills, because I think that there are majorities that want some of this, at least the Israel portion of it, at least, to go through. So I am doubtful how much these hard lines being drawn in the media are actually hard lines at the end of the day.
Right. And I think one thing I skipped over in my excitement to explain how House Republicans can develop a position on Ukraine is really that point Kim was making, which is that the president of the United States has an obligation to be, the first mover in offering House Republicans something as a trade to get through his Ukraine request. And it should be, I think, very politically manageable to offer a substantive fix on asylum laws. And I think there is a connection that the porous southern border does have national security implications, as well as fears of terrorism around the world are growing again. I do think the president can make concessions that make a deal far more likely, whether as one bill or split into multiple bills. But I also think the House is going to have to come up with its own bill to avoid being jammed. And the Senate does appear to be maintaining some flexibility about how a final package gets through. But again, I just close by underscoring that the stakes here are significant. I mean, China has been touting a deeper relationship with Iran. Iran, of course, owns Hamas, which is terrorizing Israel. Iran is also supporting Russia's war in Ukraine with drones, with training. So you have both of those wars in Europe and the Middle East really being Iranian-backed. And you also have North Korea feeding artillery shells into this war. I guess I say all this because there is this consolidating axis of power that we've talked about on this podcast that is increasingly working together and reading from the same book. And one question in their mind, certainly one thing they'd like to see, is for Washington to descend into political dysfunction and not be able to fend back aggression in Europe from Vladimir Putin, or to help Israel over the long haul of whatever it takes to help them destroy Hamas. That's really the broader stakes of the dysfunction. And I think that really brings it into focus on why there is some way to get this done if everybody is willing to just bend a little bit.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.